This is all of Toby's medals. This is Toby's Purple Heart. He got this here from injuries he got in Afghanistan. We were really proud of Toby when he got all these. But I would gladly give them all back just to have him back. My name is Arunda Perkins. I'm Toby Gregory's mom. He did 2 tours of Afghanistan back to back. And it was really bad. Toby was never the same after that last tour. The military just done something to him, and he ain't my Toby now.
I am Toby Gregory. I'm at the Jefferson City Correctional Center in the state of Missouri. I was given a 24-year sentence for second-degree murder due to diminished capacity for PTSD. I was born July 16, 1974. I grew up in the small town of Bell, Missouri. There wasn't a whole lot to do there. We went out to creeks and partied. And I guess ever since then, I realized that I like drinking. In my teenage years, it got more so. It didn't get totally out of control until when I joined the military. Then that was the pastime. I always thought about joining the military when I was young. But when I first got off the bus at Marine Corps boot camp, I was thinking, what did I do to myself? Why did I want to put myself through this? But then once I graduated, I felt the sense of accomplishment of earning the title as a Marine. And it was great for a while. She took a personal interest in me. And she did things to me that was not only against policy, but against the law. She would come in at gunpoint and she would sexually assault me. She would make me take Viagra and have sex with her. She actually physically choked me, and I honestly believe that she would have shot me and got away with it. She took everything from me. I felt weak, and I reported this. The things that I got was men don't get sexually assaulted. You should be glad that she's having sex with you. I was deployed to Afghanistan in 2008. I got assigned with the 2506 Infantry. We were on the supply route and we took fire rockets basically every day. December 15, 2008 is where I got my traumatic brain injury and received my Purple Heart. I heard the launch of a rocket. It actually hit the bunker that we would have been in, and it knocked me unconscious. I was shaken up. I was bleeding from the nose and mouth. I couldn't gain focus. I wasn't flown out because they needed everybody there, but there was reports that I wasn't acting right. The doctor did a couple MRIs. She noted in my file that there is substantial damage to my frontal lobe, and she documented that it was due to deployments. For Leonard Wood, Missouri, and I was retiring and coming home. I moved up around St. Louis. And finally, me and Inez got married in 2013. I had problems adjusting to civilian life. I wasn't really able to keep a job or maintain a job, and I was still trying to adjust. I didn't want to admit that I was breaking down. I don't remember anything from that day. People that had seen me that day said that they talked to me, but I wasn't right. I know I had a lack of sleep, lack of meds, alcohol was involved. I woke up the next day, handcuffed to a bed. I shot myself under the chin. It blew my front teeth out. All that's holding my face together is metal plates. When they told me that the person that was gone was Inez, it devastated me. Because at first I was in complete denial. And I guess still to this day, I am. I loved her, and I wouldn't have done it without there being other variables. And I believe that my combat service and PTSD was the cause. I was proud to have served. I was proud of everything that I have accomplished. But honestly, because of what happened, I would not have served one day in the military.
For the past 24 odd years, I've had experience treating veterans from a variety of different combat exposures from Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam. I wish that this was an isolated case. Unfortunately, when you look across the United States, they're happening way more often than they should be occurring. My name is Dr. Steve Bruce. In 2016, I was contacted by Toby Gregory's defense attorney to evaluate Mr. Gregory in jail, determine whether or not his trauma history may have become a part of why his behavior became so erratic that he ended up shooting his wife that day. Met with Mr. Gregory in jail for several hours in a room with just he and I. No attorneys were present. Mr. Gregory's medical records were significant for a trauma history while in the military. While in combat in Afghanistan, Mr. Gregory suffered from a traumatic brain injury. He stated that he started to become more paranoid, such that he thought the soldiers that he was working with were becoming part of the enemy. Puts obviously them at risk and himself at risk, to the point where his commander noticed that paranoia going on as well. And they removed him from active deployment and sent him back home. When I asked him about the events of the day of the shooting, he indicated that he had very little memory of the shooting itself. He did indicate that he had been drinking very, very heavily prior to seeing his wife and meeting her at the hotel. The fact that he was intoxicated, you're usually not going to remember the events surrounding that particularly well. With his long history of alcohol abuse in response to the triggers that he's having, and I'm confident that these significant psychological and PTSD symptoms contributed to him shooting his wife. If he did not have PTSD, I'm certain this does not happen. My job is not to excuse or justify the crime that they've committed. My job starts and ends with the evaluation. What happens after that is up to the judge, the jury, to determine the outcome. I was expecting this case to go to trial. I was expecting to be cross-examined by the prosecutor. I was expecting all of that. So the fact that a plea agreement was made was surprising to me, particularly in a first-degree murder case.
The district attorney really let us down. They agreed to a plea deal without letting any of us know. Why couldn't we have a trial by jury? That would have been the only thing that would have given us some peace. Though it would have been a tough one, that's what we were prepared to do. That was justifiable for Inez's murder. My name is Tanya, and I'm Inez's aunt. Inez and Toby lived here with me for about 3 months while they were searching for a place to live. They had a little baby boy named Blake. He was adorable. Inez knew that I had concerns. It was a sad, very controlling relationship. He told her how to dress, how to eat, how to move around. It worked on her a sense of being until she believed that she wasn't good enough. And that's how he hurt her. Toby always threatened to hurt people. Toby threatened to kill me to my face, as well as all of my family. He told my stepdad and my ex-husband that he would pick us off one at a time from the road and shoot us. He didn't like us being involved with her in any form. He wanted total control. Inez and I had many conversations. I had encouraged her to try to leave because I was worried for her safety. She says, "I know, Aunt Tanya, and I'm scared too." Inez and Toby had agreed to a divorce where they shared custody of their child, Blake. He had 2 weeks with Toby and 2 weeks with Inez, but it kept being complicated by having a hard time getting Blake back from Toby. Blake was used as a tool to keep Inez in his life. Toby was trying to take control and that child away from Inez. That was his goal. So she moved back to New Mexico to be around family, and we convinced her to get legal help. Inez showing up in court with her own attorney really angered Mr. Gregory to the point of no return. He was so livid with that because he had lost control. I shared text messages with Inez the day that she was murdered. She told me he's gone crazy and that she needed some help. She was afraid.
I don't remember what happened the day of the shooting. I loved her, and I think about the good things, how much she loved the kids, how great she was. When they told me that the person that was gone was Inez, it devastated me. Because at first, I was in complete denial. And I guess still to this day, I am. I loved her.
What a real piece of work. Wow. Boy, that angers me. I can hear that slur in his voice. He is lying through his teeth. Toby took that life out of anger. He didn't get his way. He didn't get his way in court, and he planned it all out, without a doubt.
I did not think they were a good match at all. And I always felt like there was something wrong. And, I always felt like I should have probably reached out to her a little bit more. To find out the end result was awful for me.
My name is Jesse Anderla. I served with Toby Gregory in the Army in Fort Carson, Colorado, back in 2009 to 2012.
Toby didn't really have a lot of friends other than me. He kept to himself. I was surprised that he even let me into his life. We started going like fishing every now and again, or we'd go up into the mountains and we'd shoot guns. He was always a good guy to me, and it was nice to have him as a friend. When I first met Toby, he told me that he was going through his 4th divorce. He was in his mid-30s. So I was like, whoa, like, how in the heck, like, how do you go through 4 divorces in, that short amount of time? And he was almost proud of it too. Like that's the crazy part about it. Me, Toby, and Inez were all in Afghanistan. Inez, she was a great soldier. She was happy. She was great person. Toby had told me that him and Inez were essentially having an affair. And it was honestly kind of shocking when Toby told me that they got married. All of a sudden, she's out of the military, he's out of the military, they're in Missouri, they're getting married, and they had a kid, and I was just like, whoa, like, how is this gonna work? I think I was, over the years, his confidant. I think that I was able to talk him down from a lot of things and to calm him down and everything else. If he would have called me and talked to me, I think that I could have probably prevented this from happening, honestly.
When the forensics evaluation came from St. Louis, he evaluated me in detail. In that report, he stated that combat PTSD played a part in this shooting and the shooting of myself. I think it was a triggered PTSD response with the stress, lack of meds. That is what I feel. That is what I believe.
It kind of pisses me off, I'm not gonna lie. Kind of pisses me off that he's sitting there saying that. Because there's people that literally do have a lot of issues because of PTSD. And to sit there and blame this on PTSD is wrong. So, like, with my PTSD, I don't like being in crowds. I don't, it's scary for me. My adrenaline goes and I start sweating and I'm paranoid. If I had a gun in that situation, I'm not gonna pull it out and just start shooting people. And I'm not gonna drive across town and be like, oh, I had a trigger, let me go in and shoot somebody. PTSD, it doesn't work like that. Like nobody has a reaction for that long. I love the guy, you know, he's my buddy, my friend, right? But no matter how much I love him, he did this. He committed a crime. He killed somebody.
To me, it was an open and shut case. Toby Gregory got in his car, angry, and took off headed towards Owensville. It was first-degree murder. I had no doubts about that. My name's Randy Esporst. I was Gasconade County Sheriff from 2004 through 2016. When I arrived, I saw somebody being loaded into an ambulance and taken away. I went down to where the other victim was. I took the blanket off and I saw a female laying on her back with multiple gunshot wounds, mostly to the head. While I was in the parking lot, I happened to look up and I saw a camera. So I went to the manager's office and asked him, "Do your surveillance cameras work?" And he said, "Yes, it does." It's hard for me to watch because I know what's going to happen. He got out of that car and there are 4 other doors before you get to hers. He just walked past those and went directly to the end room. We found blood in the room, so we know that she was shot at least once in there. But she was still able to walk out of the room, and then she just collapsed onto the ground, and he just stands over her and he fires 4 shots and then kicks her in the head. I mean, this is rage. This is just out of control rage. It's an execution. I mean, there's no other word for that. It's an execution. It should have been first-degree murder, and it should have been life. Or it should have been the needle in the arm.
It says in the Bible that I'm not supposed to hate anybody. I have a hard time with that one. Because I have a lot of hatred and anger inside of me for that person. And I don't like the way it makes me feel. I'm John Tolk. Inez was my only daughter. When Inez came to me and told me she was joining the military, it kind of scared me because Desert Storm was going on and things like that. But I felt real proud of her because I knew that's what she wanted to do, and she wanted to serve her country. And then she met Toby. I told Inez that I didn't trust the guy and I didn't feel right about the guy, you know. I had bad vibes, which I don't usually have those with very many people, but he gave them to me. And she said, no, it's okay. So I told her, just keep your eyes open and be real careful. He was very insecure and cowardly, and he would threaten people. Well, not to their face, but behind their back, saying that, oh no, I can kill anybody, I can get away with it because I can claim PTSD. That was one of his biggest things. Get out of jail free card is what he considered it. I received a phone call explaining that they had signed a plea deal, which really bothered me because this man murdered my daughter in cold blood. I told the lawyer on the telephone that he told me how he could kill anybody and claim PTSD, and he would get away with it. The lawyer had told me, oh, I didn't know that. I said, because you never called me. They'd never called me to ask me questions. Inez was the most important thing in my life, and to know I could never hold my daughter again just tears me up. It hurts my heart more than I could ever explain. It's I just miss my baby. And
I can understand why people might not believe that I don't remember anything from that day. I don't know if I was on autopilot or what was going on or what my state of mind was. And that is something that I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. Nobody is going to punish me more than I punish myself. Every day I'm reminded by the scar on my face that even though I can't remember the events, I know what took place, why I'm here.
PTSD, it's more of an immediate thing. So as soon as, like, okay, this happened, now I have this reaction, right? And then once you're out of that moment, you start to calm down and your adrenaline starts to drop. If I had a gun in that situation, I'm not gonna pull it out and just start shooting people. Like nobody has a reaction for that long.
I'm not gonna lie, it hurts. It hurts to hear him say that. PTSD is not an instant. PTSD can last for days. It's about the event that's taken place, where your mind's at. Well, I don't know what played out from that morning till when this happened. You can't say, hey, if I had a gun, I'm not gonna do this. How do you know? Because you've never been in that situation where you had it. I think I should be released. I mean, I want to be released. Nobody wants to be in prison. But my intention is not to just to go back out and try to live my life. My intention is to go to the VA hospital. I know what some people will say. They will say that he shouldn't be out. He should never be out. If he did it once, he's going to do it again. But this prison environment is another battlefield. Treatment for PTSD is non-existent in here. I can't talk about things that I've done in combat because they might take it the wrong way. I've been told this, that I can't mention none of this, but this is what I need to talk about.
But if you're released from prison and you haven't had the treatment that you say you need, is that not dangerous to let someone like you out?
I'm not going to answer that one.
On a warm July morning in 1992, thousands of Londoners were beginning another ordinary day. Commuters hurried toward train stations. Parents pushed strollers through quiet parks. Joggers followed familiar paths across the city's open spaces, believing daylight offered protection from the dangers that haunted darker hours. Wimbledon Common was one of those places. Vast, green, peaceful. A landscape where families gathered, dog walkers exchanged polite greetings, and children chased butterflies beneath towering trees. Nothing about that summer morning suggested it would become one of the darkest chapters in modern British criminal history. Yet within hours, the illusion of safety would be shattered forever. Rachel Nichol was 23 years old. Friends described her as warm, intelligent, and deeply devoted to her young son. She had taken 2-year-old Alex for a walk across Wimbledon Common with the family dog, a routine that had become part of everyday life. The common stretched across hundreds of acres, offering winding paths through grassland and woodland that felt surprisingly remote, despite being surrounded by one of the world's largest cities. It was a place where people escaped the noise of London. On that Monday morning, Rachel expected nothing more than a quiet walk beneath the summer sun. Instead, somewhere along a secluded footpath, violence erupted with terrifying speed. What happened in those final moments was reconstructed only through forensic evidence and the haunting testimony of the only witness who survived the little boy too young to understand the horror unfolding before him. Rachel was subjected to a brutal, frenzied attack. She suffered dozens of stab wounds in an assault so savage that seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend the level of violence. Her attacker fled almost as suddenly as he had appeared, disappearing into the surrounding woodland while the common continued to fill with unsuspecting visitors. Minutes later, passers-by made a discovery that would leave even experienced police officers shaken. Rachel lay mortally wounded on the ground. Nearby, little Alex remained with his mother, confused and frightened, reportedly attempting to comfort her in the only way a 2-year-old could. The image would become one of the most heartbreaking scenes ever associated with a British murder investigation. It was impossible to separate the crime itself from the devastating human tragedy left behind. News spread through London with astonishing speed. Television bulletins interrupted regular programming. Newspaper presses rushed to prepare special editions. Headlines described an apparently random murder committed in broad daylight in one of the capital's best-known public spaces. Fear spread far beyond Wimbledon. Women questioned whether they could safely walk alone even during daylight hours. Parents reconsidered familiar routes through local parks. For many, the murder represented something deeply unsettling. If an attack this vicious could happen on a busy summer morning, nowhere seemed completely safe. The Metropolitan Police immediately launched one of the largest murder investigations Britain had seen in years. Detectives flooded Wimbledon Common, sealing off large sections, while forensic specialists painstakingly examined every inch of the scene. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the inquiry. Thousands of potential witnesses were interviewed. Every discarded object, every footprint, Every fiber became a possible clue. This was 1992. DNA profiling existed, but it remained a relatively new forensic tool compared with the sophisticated techniques investigators would develop decades later. Detectives understood that biological evidence recovered from the scene could become crucial, but extracting useful information required painstaking laboratory work and technology that was still evolving. Every sample had to be preserved with extraordinary care. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention to the people who had been on Wimbledon Common that morning. Joggers, cyclists, dog walkers, families, park workers, anyone who might have noticed unusual behavior before or after the attack. Witnesses described unfamiliar men walking through the area. Some reported individuals behaving nervously. Others recalled nothing at all. The Common was enormous, its intersecting paths allowing countless opportunities for someone to arrive unnoticed and leave just as quietly. Psychological profilers studied the nature of the attack itself. The sheer level of violence suggested an offender capable of extreme aggression. Whether Rachel had been specifically targeted or selected at random remained uncertain during the earliest stages of the investigation. That uncertainty terrified both detectives and the public alike. If the victim had simply crossed paths with a stranger driven by violent impulses, the killer could strike again anywhere. As days turned into weeks, thousands of tips poured into police headquarters. Some seemed credible. Others proved impossible to verify. Officers worked around the clock chasing leads that often collapsed almost as quickly as they appeared. Every possible suspect had to be examined. Every alibi had to be tested. Every rumor demanded attention. Public pressure intensified with each passing day. Newspapers questioned whether the police were making progress. Television commentators debated the safety of Britain's public spaces. Rachel Nichols' photograph appeared on front pages across the country, transforming her from a young mother enjoying a summer walk into the face of one of Britain's most shocking unsolved murders. Yet beneath the intense media scrutiny, investigators faced a far more difficult reality. They possessed fragments of evidence, mountains of information, and an increasingly frightened public, but they still did not know the identity of the man who had carried out the attack. Somewhere beyond the police cordons and television cameras, the killer remained free, watching the investigation unfold from the shadows while one question echoed across London. How could someone commit such a savage crime in broad daylight and simply disappear? In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded at a pace rarely seen in a British murder inquiry. The Metropolitan Police established what became known as Operation Edzell, a massive effort involving hundreds of officers, analysts, forensic specialists, and support staff. Every day began with new briefings, updated suspect lists, and another stack of witness statements waiting to be reviewed. Detectives understood that the first weeks after a homicide often offered the greatest chance of identifying a killer. Memories were still fresh. Physical evidence had not yet deteriorated. Someone, somewhere, almost certainly knew something. The challenge was separating the crucial detail from thousands of ordinary observations that had little or nothing to do with the crime. Wimbledon Common itself became a focal point unlike anything residents had experienced before. Officers returned repeatedly, retracing footpaths at different times of day, attempting to understand how the attacker might have approached Rachel Nichols without attracting attention, and, just as importantly, how he had managed to leave. Helicopters surveyed the landscape from above. Search teams combed through dense vegetation. Specialists examined areas that had initially seemed insignificant, hoping to recover clothing fibers, discarded objects, or traces that earlier searches might have overlooked. Even the smallest discovery could alter the direction of the investigation. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. A flood of telephone calls reached the incident room. Some callers reported suspicious men they had noticed in nearby neighborhoods. Others believed they recognized a face from police appeals broadcast on television. A handful offered information based on little more than instinct or rumor. Detectives could not afford to dismiss any of it outright. Every name entered the system. Every allegation demanded at least some level of scrutiny. The volume of information became both a blessing and a burden. While valuable intelligence might be hidden somewhere within the thousands of reports, finding it required extraordinary time and patience. At the same time, forensic scientists worked carefully with the biological evidence recovered from the scene. By the early 1990s, DNA profiling had already demonstrated its potential in criminal investigations, but the science was still developing. Laboratories required high-quality samples, and the analytical methods available were far less sensitive than those that would emerge in later decades. Investigators knew they possessed evidence that could prove decisive, yet they also recognized the limitations of contemporary technology. The profile they developed would become an essential part of the case, but only if it could eventually be matched to the right individual. Pressure mounted from every direction. Newspapers questioned whether the police were moving quickly enough. Television news programs carried nightly updates. Editorials demanded answers. The murder had shaken public confidence because it appeared so random. Rachel had not been attacked in a deserted alleyway after midnight. She had been walking with her small son on a summer morning in one of London's best-known public spaces. If detectives failed to identify the offender, many feared another attack was only a matter of time. As investigators constructed a behavioral profile, they began considering what sort of offender could commit such an extraordinarily violent assault. Specialists from the emerging field of criminal psychology examined the evidence, searching for patterns that might reveal personality traits, previous offending, or likely future behavior. The brutality of the attack suggested an individual capable of intense violence. Whether the assault had been sexually motivated, driven by fantasy, or triggered by some other psychological impulse remained the subject of careful analysis. While profiling could never identify a specific person, detectives hoped it would narrow the enormous field of possible suspects. One name eventually began drawing increasing attention: Colin Stagg, a local unemployed man who regularly walked on Wimbledon Common with his dog. Stagg lived alone, had an interest in the occult and fantasy literature, and, in the eyes of some investigators, seemed to fit aspects of the emerging offender profile. Importantly, however, suspicion alone was not evidence. Detectives searched for physical links connecting him to the crime. They examined his movements, interviewed acquaintances, and compared available forensic material. The DNA recovered from the murder scene did not match him. Other objective evidence remained inconclusive. Yet the investigation continued to focus heavily on Stagg. Faced with the absence of sufficient evidence to bring charges, officers sought advice from behavioral experts. Among those consulted was criminal psychologist Dr. Paul Britton, whose work in offender profiling had attracted considerable public attention. Discussions between investigators and psychologists led to an unusual and ultimately highly controversial strategy. Instead of relying solely on conventional investigative methods, police planned an undercover operation designed to encourage Stagg to reveal incriminating information if he truly were the killer. An undercover female police officer assumed a false identity and began corresponding with Stagg. Their communications continued over an extended period through letters and meetings arranged under carefully controlled conditions. The operation attempted to build trust while steering conversations toward increasingly intimate and violent subjects. Investigators hoped that, if Stagg had committed the murder, he might disclose details known only to the killer or otherwise implicate himself through his own words. The operation consumed months of effort. Every conversation was documented. Every letter was preserved. Senior investigators believed they were closing in on the man responsible for one of Britain's most notorious murders. Yet beneath that confidence lay a critical problem. Despite the elaborate undercover strategy, no confession emerged. No hidden knowledge of the crime surfaced. No forensic evidence suddenly appeared to bridge the gap between suspicion and proof. The case was approaching a decisive moment, and the choices made during that period would not only shape the investigation, but also become one of the most controversial chapters in the history of British policing. The investigation into Rachel Nicholas' murder had reached a dangerous turning point. After months of searching, thousands of interviews, and relentless public pressure, detectives were desperate for a breakthrough. The public wanted answers. The media demanded progress. And inside the investigation room, officers faced a painful reality. Despite all their efforts, the man responsible for the brutal killing on Wimbledon Common had not been identified. The DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene remained one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. It represented the possibility of a definitive answer, a scientific fingerprint that could separate the truth from speculation. But in 1992, forensic technology had not yet reached the level it would decades later. Investigators had a profile, but no match. The evidence existed, but it had no name attached to it. And as the pressure increased, attention turned toward a local man who seemed, at least in the eyes of some investigators, to fit a troubling pattern. His name was Colin Stagg. Stagg lived near Wimbledon Common and was known to regularly walk his dog in the area. Investigators began looking closely at his personal life, his personality, and his behavior. Some details attracted suspicion. He was considered socially isolated. He had unusual interests. He was perceived by some officers as someone who appeared uncomfortable in social situations. But suspicion was not proof. A person's personality, hobbies, or lifestyle could not establish guilt. The most important fact remained unchanged. The physical evidence did not connect Colin Stagg to Rachel Nichols' murder. His DNA did not match the sample recovered from the crime scene. For many investigators, that should have been a warning. The absence of forensic evidence meant the case against him was weak, but the investigation had entered a period where psychological theories and behavioral assumptions began to influence the direction of the inquiry. The belief that the killer might be a particular type of offender created a lens through which investigators viewed potential suspects. In an effort to obtain evidence, police launched one of the most controversial undercover operations in British criminal history. The operation became known as Operation Esdell. A female undercover officer was assigned to create a false identity and establish a relationship with Stagg. Her mission was not simply to gather information. It was to gain his trust and encourage him to reveal whether he possessed knowledge only the murderer could know. The undercover officer communicated with Stagg through letters and meetings. The conversations gradually became more personal and more provocative. Investigators hoped that emotional pressure might cause a guilty person to confess or reveal something impossible for an innocent person to know. The strategy was based on a dangerous assumption that if Stagg was the killer, he would eventually expose himself. But as the operation continued, something unexpected happened. Stagg did not confess. He did not provide secret details from the crime scene. He did not reveal information proving that he had murdered Rachel Nichols. Instead, the operation produced conversations that were later criticized as attempts to manipulate him into making incriminating statements. The undercover officer encouraged discussions about violent fantasies and criminal behavior, but the evidence gathered remained far from the clear admission investigators needed. Despite these problems, police continued to believe they were close to solving the case. In August 1993, more than a year after Rachel Nichols' murder, Colin Stagg was arrested and charged with her killing. The announcement shocked Britain. To many members of the public, the arrest appeared to bring closure. Newspapers published images of Stagg. Headlines suggested that the mystery of Wimbledon Common had finally been solved. A grieving family and a frightened community waited for justice. But inside the courtroom, the strength of the prosecution's case began to collapse. The evidence was examined under intense legal scrutiny. The defense challenged the methods used by police, particularly the undercover operation. The question was not only whether Colin Stagg looked suspicious. The question was whether the evidence against him was reliable, lawful, and strong enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The court ultimately reached a devastating conclusion for the prosecution. The undercover evidence was ruled inadmissible. The judge found that the operation had gone too far, effectively encouraging Stagg to make statements he might not otherwise have made. Without that evidence, the prosecution case was severely weakened. In September 1994, the case against Colin Stagg was abandoned. He was released. The man who had spent more than a year living under the shadow of one of Britain's most notorious murders walked free. But freedom did not mean his life returned to normal. The accusation had already changed everything. His name had become associated with a crime he did not commit. His face had appeared across newspapers and television screens. Many people who had never met him believed he was guilty. Even after the court cleared him, suspicion followed him. The collapse of the case created a new crisis for investigators. If Colin Stagg was not the killer, then who was? The murder of Rachel Nichol remained unsolved. The real offender was still out there, and the DNA evidence that could eventually reveal the truth remained locked away, waiting for technology that did not yet exist. Years passed. The headlines faded. The public moved on to other crimes. But for Rachel's family, there was no moving on. There was only an unanswered question that refused to disappear. Who was the man who walked onto Wimbledon Common that morning? Who attacked a young mother in front of her child? And how many years would pass before science finally caught up with the evidence left behind? The answer would come from a place investigators in 1992 could barely imagine, a future where DNA technology would become powerful enough to reopen old wounds, revisit forgotten evidence, and finally reveal the identity of the person who had escaped justice for years. After Colin Stagg was released and the prosecution case collapsed in 1994, the Rachel Nichol investigation entered one of the most frustrating periods imaginable for detectives, for Rachel's family, and for a public that had expected answers. The arrest that many believed would finally close the case had instead created a deeper mystery. The man who had been accused was not the man responsible. The real killer had never been found. Somewhere, someone had committed an act of unimaginable violence on Wimbledon Common and then disappeared into ordinary life. The failure of the case became a painful reminder of one of the hardest realities in criminal investigations: the difference between suspicion and proof. Detectives had followed a path that seemed promising, but the evidence did not support the conclusion. The investigation had focused intensely on one person while the true offender remained unidentified. For Rachel's family, the aftermath was devastating. The trial process and media coverage had forced them to relive the tragedy repeatedly, only to end without justice. Rachel's parents had already suffered the unbearable loss of their daughter. Now they faced another painful reality: the person responsible was still unknown. The Metropolitan Police continued to maintain that the investigation was not closed. The case remained active, but progress was slow. The physical evidence collected from Wimbledon Common still existed. The DNA profile developed during the original investigation remained an important piece of the puzzle. But in the mid-1990s, the technology and databases available to investigators were limited compared with what would come later. The DNA profile was like a message written in a language that science had not yet learned to fully understand. The evidence could tell investigators that the killer had left a biological signature behind. But without a matching individual in the system, it could not reveal a name. And so the years passed. Wimbledon Common slowly returned to normal. People continued walking the same paths where Rachel had taken her final steps. Children played nearby. Dog walkers crossed the open fields. For many residents, the landscape carried a permanent shadow. A place once associated with peaceful mornings had become forever linked to one of Britain's most disturbing crimes. The murder remained a symbol of vulnerability. Rachel had not been hidden away in a dangerous location. She had been in a public place during daylight. She had been with her young son. The randomness of the attack was what frightened so many people. It represented the possibility that ordinary life could be interrupted by extraordinary violence without warning. Meanwhile, investigators continued reviewing the case. Cold cases often survive because of one simple belief: evidence does not expire. Witnesses may disappear. Memories may fade. Investigative methods may change. But physical evidence can remain waiting for the right moment. That moment would come from advances in forensic science. During the years after Rachel's murder, DNA technology developed at an extraordinary pace. Techniques became more sensitive. Databases expanded. scientists gained the ability to analyze smaller and older samples with greater accuracy. What had once been only a partial answer became a potential pathway to identifying unknown offenders. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, police forces across Britain were increasingly turning back to unsolved cases. Investigators began asking new questions about old evidence. Could samples that had failed to provide answers years earlier now reveal something more? Could improvements in forensic science transform a forgotten investigation? The Rachel Nichols case was one of those investigations waiting for a second chance. The evidence recovered in 1992 was re-examined. Advances in DNA analysis allowed forensic scientists to obtain a clearer profile from material connected to the crime. The breakthrough did not come from a new witness stepping forward or a dramatic confession. It came from science doing what science does best, finding answers hidden inside details that had been overlooked or impossible to interpret before. The new analysis eventually produced a result that changed everything. The DNA profile did not match Colin Stagg. That confirmation was not only important scientifically, it also reinforced what the court had already determined years earlier. Stagg had not been the man responsible for Rachel's murder. But the DNA evidence did something far more significant. It pointed investigators toward another individual. A name began to emerge from the forensic work. That name was Robert Napper. Napper was not a stranger to investigators. He had previously been convicted of serious crimes, including the murders of Samantha Bissett and her young daughter Jasmine in 1993. He had a documented history of extreme violence and had been diagnosed with serious mental health disorders. The connection between Napper and the Rachel Nichols case would force investigators to reconsider the events of 1992 through a completely different perspective. The discovery was a major turning point. For nearly a decade, the investigation had been defined by uncertainty, controversy, and unanswered questions. Now, for the first time, detectives had a direct scientific link between a suspect and the crime scene. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unresolved was beginning to move toward the truth. But identifying a suspect was only the beginning. Investigators now faced the enormous task of proving what had happened on Wimbledon Common that summer morning in 1992. They needed to connect the forensic evidence, the timeline, and the history of the man they believed was responsible. The world had spent years asking why Rachel Nichols' killer had never been found. Now a new question emerged. Who exactly was Robert Napper, and how had he managed to remain beyond the reach of justice for so long? The answer would reveal a disturbing history of violence, missed opportunities, and a tragic chain of events that had allowed a dangerous offender to remain free when Rachel's family was still searching for answers. For nearly 10 years, the murder of Rachel Nichols had remained one of Britain's most haunting unsolved crimes. The image of that summer morning on Wimbledon Common had never disappeared. A young mother, a small child left beside her, a brutal attack carried out in a place where people believed they were safe. The investigation had become a story of unanswered questions, a warning about the limits of justice, and a painful reminder that sometimes the truth exists long before investigators have the tools to uncover it. But behind the scenes, the evidence had never truly been silent. The biological material recovered during the original investigation remained preserved. The crime scene had produced a forensic clue that could potentially identify the killer, but in 1992, the technology available to analyze it was not advanced enough to provide the answer detectives desperately needed. The DNA profile existed, but it had no name attached to it. Years later, everything began to change. By the early 2000s, forensic science had entered a new era. DNA profiling had become far more powerful and reliable. Police forces were increasingly able to revisit older cases and examine evidence using techniques that had been impossible at the time of the original investigation. Crimes once considered unsolvable were being reopened. Cold cases that had remained frozen for years were suddenly moving again. The Rachel Nichols investigation became one of those cases. Forensic experts returned to the evidence with new technology. The samples connected to the murder were analyzed again. The results provided investigators with what they had been searching for since 1992, a match. The DNA profile was linked to Robert Napper. The discovery transformed the investigation. After years of uncertainty, years of speculation, and years of questions surrounding the wrong man, detectives finally had a scientific connection between an individual and Rachel's murder. Robert Napper was not an unknown figure to authorities. His name had already appeared in connection with other serious crimes. In 1993, after Rachel's murder, but before the DNA breakthrough, Napper had been convicted of the murders of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine in London. The crimes had revealed a pattern of extreme violence and disturbing behavior. Napper had also been diagnosed with serious mental health conditions. His history showed signs of a deeply troubled individual whose actions had caused devastating harm. But the connection to Rachel Nicholas' murder would reveal something even more disturbing: that the man responsible for the attack on Wimbledon Common had been involved in other acts of violence before and after the crime. For investigators, the DNA evidence answered one crucial question. Rachel Nicholas' killer was not Colin Stagg. The case that had once centered on an innocent man was finally redirected toward the true offender. The consequences of the breakthrough were enormous. The police investigation was no longer searching through thousands of possibilities. They now had a specific suspect with a documented history and forensic evidence connecting him to the scene. But the road to justice was not simple. Because of Napper's mental health history, the legal process surrounding the case would become different from a traditional murder trial. Prosecutors and defense lawyers would have to consider not only whether Napper was responsible for Rachel's death, but also his state of mind at the time of the crime and his ability to participate in legal proceedings. The case raised difficult questions about violence, mental illness, and public safety. It forced Britain to examine how a person with a history of serious psychiatric problems could commit horrific crimes and how the justice system should respond. Before those questions could be addressed, investigators needed to reconstruct the events of July 1992. They examined Napper's movements. They reviewed previous investigations. They studied the forensic findings. They compared his known behavior with the circumstances surrounding Rachel's murder. Piece by piece, the authorities built the case that had taken nearly a decade to develop. The DNA evidence became the foundation. It represented the moment when the investigation finally escaped the shadows of speculation and entered the world of certainty. For Rachel's family, the development brought a mixture of emotions. There was relief that the person responsible had finally been identified, but there was also the painful reality that no investigation, no arrest, and no court decision could undo the loss of a daughter and mother. Nearly 10 years had passed since Rachel's final walk on Wimbledon Common. Her son had grown older. Her family had lived through years of uncertainty. Justice delayed had finally begun to arrive. But the story was not only about finding the killer, it was also about understanding how the investigation had gone wrong, why an innocent man had become the focus, and how a dangerous offender had remained free long enough to commit further crimes. The Rachel Nichols case became more than a murder investigation. It became a lesson in the importance of evidence over assumption, science over speculation, and patience over pressure. The same forensic clue that investigators had carried with them since 1992 had finally spoken. And in it had revealed the name of the man who had taken Rachel's life: Robert Napper. Yet as Britain prepared for the final chapter of the case, another difficult truth emerged. Solving a murder does not always bring a simple ending. Sometimes the answers create even more questions. Questions about missed warnings. Questions about failures in the system. Questions about whether tragedy could have been prevented. The identity of Rachel Nichols' killer was no longer a mystery, but the full story of how he reached that moment on Wimbledon Common and why justice took so long was only beginning to be revealed. The DNA breakthrough had finally answered the question that had haunted Britain for nearly a decade: who killed Rachel Nichols? But identifying Robert Napper was only the beginning. Behind the name was a disturbing history of violence, psychological problems, and missed opportunities that would force investigators and the public to confront an uncomfortable reality. The man connected through forensic science to one of Britain's most notorious murders was not someone who had appeared without warning. His past contained a series of troubling signs that, years later, would become impossible to ignore. Robert Napper was born in 1966 in South London. From an early age, his life was marked by instability and serious personal difficulties. Those who studied his background later identified a history of emotional problems and behavioral concerns that developed over many years. His childhood was troubled, and as he grew older, his mental health deteriorated. He experienced severe psychological issues, including paranoid beliefs and violent fantasies. By adulthood, Napper had become increasingly isolated. His behavior became more disturbing, and he struggled to maintain normal relationships and everyday stability. Authorities would later learn that he had a fascination with violence and had engaged in threatening behavior before the Rachel Nichols murder. Yet in the years before July 1992, the full danger he represented was not understood. That failure would become one of the most painful aspects of the case. Before Rachel Nichols was murdered, Napper had already come into contact with the criminal justice system. He had been investigated for serious offenses, and there were warning signs that suggested he posed a risk. But those concerns did not lead to the intervention that might have prevented future violence. The murder on Wimbledon Common changed everything. When detectives eventually connected Napper's DNA to Rachel's killing, they began examining his history with a new perspective. The investigation was no longer simply about proving what happened on one morning in July 1992. It was about understanding the path that had led there. The evidence suggested that Rachel's murder was not an isolated moment of unexplained violence. It was part of a pattern involving an individual with a long and complex history of mental illness and dangerous behavior. Napper's name had already become associated with another devastating crime. In 1993, approximately 1 year after Rachel's murder, he was arrested and later convicted for the murders of Samantha Bissett and her young daughter Jasmine. The crime shocked London. A mother and child had been killed inside their home, and investigators discovered evidence linking Napper to the attack. That conviction placed him in a secure psychiatric facility where he remained under treatment. But years later, after advances in DNA analysis connected him to Rachel Nichols' murder, investigators realized they had been dealing with the same offender all along. The revelation created a wave of public anger and renewed scrutiny. How could someone capable of such violence have remained free after previous warning signs? Were opportunities missed? Could Rachel's death have been prevented? These questions became central to the wider discussion surrounding the case. The tragedy was not only about one criminal act, it was also about systems designed to identify and manage dangerous individuals. Napper's history raised difficult debates about mental health services, risk assessment, and communication between agencies. For Rachel's family, however, the focus remained much more personal. They had spent years waiting for the truth. The arrest of Colin Stagg had brought unwanted attention and false hope. The collapse of that case had reopened their wounds. Now, nearly 10 years after Rachel's death, the real offender had finally been identified. But justice would look different from what many expected. Because of Napper's severe mental health conditions, prosecutors did not pursue a conventional murder trial in the same way they might have with another defendant. The legal process focused on determining responsibility while considering his psychiatric state at the time of the crime. In 2008, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nichols on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He admitted responsibility for the killing and was ordered to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital in England. The legal outcome reflected the complex nature of the case. The court accepted that Napper had committed the crime, but also recognized the significant role of his mental illness. He was not released into the community. He remained under secure psychiatric care. For many people watching from outside the courtroom, the result carried conflicting emotions. There was relief that Rachel's killer had finally been identified. There was recognition that the evidence had finally succeeded where earlier efforts had failed. But there was also sadness. No verdict could restore Rachel S. life. No legal decision could erase the memory of her final moments or the years her family spent waiting for answers. The case became a landmark example of the power of DNA technology. A tiny piece of biological evidence preserved from a crime scene nearly a decade earlier had accomplished what countless interviews, searches, and investigations could not. But it also became a warning. The Rachel Nichol investigation showed the dangers of allowing suspicion to replace evidence. It demonstrated how easily public pressure could influence an investigation. It revealed the devastating consequences when the wrong person becomes the center of a criminal case. Colin Stagg's experience became a major discussion point about investigative methods and the protection of innocent suspects. His name had been connected to a crime he did not commit, and the damage caused by that mistake followed him long after his release. At the same time, Robert Naparest's conviction forced Britain to confront another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person responsible for a terrible crime leaves behind warning signs long before the final act of violence occurs. The murder of Rachel Nichol was finally solved, but the questions surrounding the case would remain for years. Questions about missed opportunities. Questions about justice. Questions about whether a tragedy that changed many lives could have been prevented. On Wimbledon Common, the paths where Rachel once walked remain open. People still pass through that landscape every day. Dogs still run across the grass. Families still enjoy the peaceful surroundings. But beneath the ordinary rhythm of life, the memory remains. A young mother who never returned home. A child who lost his mother. A family who waited years for the truth. And a case that proved one of the most powerful lessons in modern criminal investigation. Sometimes the answer is already there, hidden in the evidence, waiting for the world to develop the tools needed to finally uncover it. For nearly 16 years, the name Rachel Nichol had been associated with one of the most disturbing murder investigations in British history, a crime committed in daylight, a mother killed while walking with her young son, a suspect wrongly accused, a case that exposed the limits of early forensic science and the dangers of investigative pressure. But when Robert Napper was finally identified through DNA evidence, the investigation entered its final and most complicated stage. The question was no longer who had killed Rachel. Science had answered that. The question now was how the justice system would respond to the man responsible. By the time Robert Napper was linked to the murder, he was already serving a sentence in a secure psychiatric hospital for the murders of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine. His history was already known to authorities. His mental health problems had been extensively documented. His violent behavior had become the subject of intense examination. But the legal process surrounding Rachel Nichol's death required a careful examination of events that had happened years earlier. Investigators reviewed every piece of evidence again. They reconstructed the timeline. They studied the forensic connection between Napper and the scene on Wimbledon Common. They examined his previous crimes and his psychological condition. The objective was not simply to establish that he had committed the act, but to understand his state of mind at the time. British law recognizes that severe mental illness can affect criminal responsibility. The concept of diminished responsibility allows a court to consider whether a person's mental condition substantially impaired their ability to understand their actions or control their behavior. In Naparest's case, psychiatric evaluations played a central role. Experts examined his history, his diagnoses, and his behavior. They concluded that he suffered from serious mental disorders, including paranoid schizophrenia, which had affected his thoughts and actions. The legal proceedings therefore focused on responsibility and mental state rather than a traditional contest over identity. The evidence connecting Napper to Rachel's murder was overwhelming. The DNA match was the turning point. After years of uncertainty, the forensic link provided what investigators had lacked since 1992, direct scientific evidence. The biological material recovered from the crime scene connected Napper to the attack and removed the doubts that had surrounded the investigation for so long. For Rachel's family, this moment carried enormous emotional weight. The truth had finally arrived. But the truth also brought back memories they had spent years trying to survive. Rachel's death had changed their lives forever. The years of investigation, the media attention, the failed prosecution of Colin Stagg, and the eventual discovery of Robert Napper created a long and painful journey toward justice. There was no celebration in the traditional sense. There was only the recognition that the person responsible had finally been identified. The case also forced Britain to look back at the investigation that had failed. The wrongful focus on Colin Stagg became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire affair. His arrest in 1993 had been widely reported. Many people assumed that the mystery was solved. But the collapse of the prosecution revealed serious problems in the way investigators had approached the case. The undercover operation used to gather evidence against Stagg was heavily criticized. The court ruled that the evidence obtained through the operation was inadmissible, and the prosecution could not continue. Years later, when Napper was identified through DNA, the significance of that failure became even clearer. The real killer had been someone else. The man who had been publicly blamed had been innocent. The Rachel Nicholl case became a major example of why criminal investigations must be built on reliable evidence rather than assumptions. It demonstrated the danger of allowing a theory to become stronger than the facts. But the case also showed the extraordinary power of forensic science. Without DNA technology, Robert Napper might never have been identified as Rachel's killer. The investigation could have remained permanently unresolved. The evidence collected in 1992 might have stayed silent forever. Instead, scientific progress gave investigators a second chance. A decade earlier, the technology could not provide an answer. Now it could. The legal conclusion came in 2008 when Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nicholl on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was ordered to remain detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital. The outcome reflected the unusual circumstances of the case. It acknowledged that Napper was responsible for Rachel's death while recognizing the role of his severe mental illness. Rather than a conventional prison sentence, the court ordered continued secure psychiatric detention. For many members of the public, the decision was difficult to process. Some believe the outcome did not feel like the punishment they expected for such a horrific crime. Others recognized that the legal system had to consider both accountability and medical reality. The case existed at the intersection of criminal justice and mental health, where simple answers rarely exist. But one fact remained clear. Rachel Nicholl's killer had finally been found. The investigation that had begun with confusion, fear, and uncertainty had reached its conclusion through the evidence that had been waiting all along. Yet even after the legal process ended, the impact of the case continued. The murder changed how police approached major investigations. It influenced discussions about forensic evidence, undercover operations, and the treatment of suspects. It became a case studied by investigators, legal experts, and psychologists because of the many lessons it contained. It showed how quickly an innocent person's life could be damaged by public suspicion. It showed how vital forensic science could be in correcting past mistakes. And it showed that even when years pass, evidence can still hold the key to the truth. On Wimbledon Common, time continued moving forward. The crowds returned. The pathways remained open. The landscape slowly became ordinary again. But for those who remembered Rachel, it was never just an ordinary place. It was where a young mother's life ended. It was where a community lost its sense of security. And it was where one of Britain's longest and most controversial murder investigations began. Years later, the answer finally came. Not through a confession, not through a dramatic courtroom revelation, but through a microscopic piece of evidence left behind on a summer morning in 1992. A piece of evidence that waited patiently until science caught up with it. A piece of evidence that finally gave Rachel Nicholl the justice her family had spent so many years seeking. The murder of Rachel Nicholl was finally solved, but the story did not end with the identification of Robert Napper. In many ways, the case became even more significant after justice was reached because it forced Britain to confront the failures, controversies, and painful lessons hidden behind one of the most publicized criminal investigations of the modern era. The world remembered the crime because of its brutality. A young mother attacked in broad daylight, a small child left beside her. A peaceful corner of London transformed into a symbol of fear. But investigators, legal experts, and the public would also remember the case because of what happened afterward, the mistakes that nearly sent an innocent man to prison, the limitations of early forensic investigation, and the eventual triumph of science over speculation. For Colin Stagg, the aftermath of the case was a story of personal damage and public misunderstanding. When he was arrested in 1993, many people believed the police had caught Rachel as killer. Newspapers published his photograph. Television reports discussed the allegations. The public reaction was intense. In the eyes of many observers, suspicion became almost the same as guilt. But the evidence told a different story. The DNA recovered from the crime scene did not match Colin Stagg. There was no physical evidence linking him to Rachel's murder. The undercover operation that had been designed to obtain a confession failed to produce the proof required for a conviction. In court, the methods used during the operation were examined carefully, and the evidence obtained through that process was ruled inadmissible. Without that evidence, the prosecution case could not continue. Colin Stagg walked free. But leaving the courtroom did not erase what had happened. For more than a year, he had lived under the weight of being accused of one of Britain's most shocking crimes. His reputation had been damaged. His personal life had been disrupted. Even after the legal system cleared him, the public memory of the case remained complicated. The collapse of the prosecution became a national debate about police methods and the danger of focusing too heavily on one suspect before enough evidence exists. The case highlighted an important principle in criminal investigation. A theory is not the same thing as proof. Detectives often work under enormous pressure. They must make decisions with incomplete information. They must follow leads, evaluate suspects, and attempt to predict the behavior of people capable of extreme violence. But the Rachel Nicholl investigation demonstrated how dangerous it can become when a suspected offender is allowed to replace the evidence itself. Years later, when Robert Napper was identified, the importance of those lessons became even clearer. The real killer had not been hidden behind a complex conspiracy. He had not escaped because investigators had no evidence. He had escaped because the evidence available at the time could not yet reveal his identity. That distinction changed everything. The DNA evidence had existed since the original investigation. The biological material was there. The answer was already present in the case files. The missing element was technology. This became one of the most powerful messages from the investigation. Cold cases are not always forgotten cases. Sometimes they are simply waiting for the future. During the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA science developed rapidly. National databases expanded. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators gained the ability to analyze evidence that had once seemed impossible to use. Across Britain and around the world, old cases were reopened because forensic science had advanced. The Rachel Nicholl murder became a landmark example of this transformation. The same evidence that had failed to identify the killer in 1992 eventually became the key to finding him. The breakthrough also changed public understanding of forensic investigation. DNA was no longer viewed as a mysterious scientific tool used only in laboratories. It became a symbol of justice delayed but not necessarily denied. For Rachel's family, however, the scientific victory could never erase the personal loss. The investigation may have lasted years. The headlines may have changed. The court proceedings may have ended. But the absence of Rachel remained permanent. Her son, Alex, had lost his mother at an age when memories are formed through photographs and stories rather than personal experience. His childhood had been shaped by a tragedy he was too young to understand when it happened. The family had waited years for answers, but answers could never bring back the person they had lost. That reality is often the forgotten part of cold cases. Solving a crime does not restore the past. It does not undo the moment when a life was taken. It only provides the truth. And sometimes, truth is the only form of justice that remains possible. The Rachel Nichols case also raised broader questions about the relationship between mental health and criminal responsibility. Robert Napar's history showed the complexity of dealing with individuals suffering from severe psychiatric disorders. His crimes forced authorities to examine whether warning signs had been recognized, whether communication between agencies had been effective, and whether enough had been done to manage the risks associated with his behavior. These discussions were not simple. The case did not offer easy explanations. Mental illness alone does not determine violence, and the vast majority of people experiencing mental health problems are not dangerous. But Napar's history demonstrated the importance of identifying individuals who present serious risks and ensuring that appropriate systems are in place. The tragedy of Rachel Nichols' death became part of a much larger conversation about public safety, criminal justice, and mental health care. It became a case studied not only because a killer was eventually identified, but because so many different elements came together. A crime that shocked a nation. An investigation that went in the wrong direction. A suspect who was wrongly accused. A killer who remained hidden. And finally, science that revealed the truth. The story of Rachel Nichols' murder remains one of the most important examples of how criminal investigations can evolve over time. It showed that justice is not always immediate. Sometimes it requires patience, technological advancement, and the willingness to revisit past decisions. The answer came years after the crime. But it came. The evidence survived. The investigation continued. And the truth eventually emerged from the smallest traces left behind on Wimbledon Common. A place that had once represented fear became a reminder of something else. That even in the darkest cases, evidence can endure. That mistakes can be corrected. And that after years of silence, a forgotten voice can finally be heard. For years, the murder of Rachel Nichols stood as a symbol of uncertainty. It was a case filled with unanswered questions, painful memories, and a community that had never truly recovered from the shock of what happened on Wimbledon Common. The investigation had experienced one of the most controversial chapters in British policing history. An innocent man had been accused. A killer had remained hidden, and a family had waited through years of silence for the truth. But hidden inside the case file was the one thing that had never changed. The evidence. The murder scene had always contained the key to the mystery. In 1992, investigators collected biological material connected to the attack. At the time, forensic science was already beginning to transform criminal investigations, but the technology was still limited. Scientists could create DNA profiles, but the ability to search, compare, and identify individuals was far less advanced than it would become in later years. The evidence existed. The answer existed. But the connection between the two did not yet exist. That changed as science advanced. By the beginning of the 21st century, DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools available to investigators. A biological sample could reveal an identity with a level of certainty that traditional investigative methods could never achieve. Fingerprints, witness statements, and psychological profiles could all help direct an investigation, but DNA could provide something different. A direct scientific link. The Rachel Nichols case was reopened with fresh eyes. Investigators returned to evidence that had been collected years earlier. They examined material using improved techniques, hoping that technology had finally caught up with the mystery. This time, it did. The forensic work produced a DNA profile that changed the entire direction of the investigation. The profile matched Robert Napper. The significance of the discovery was enormous. For almost 10 years, the investigation had been surrounded by controversy because the wrong person had become the focus. Colin Stagg had spent years carrying the consequences of suspicion, while the real offender remained unidentified. Now, DNA evidence provided what the original investigation had lacked: a clear connection between the crime scene and the person responsible. The science had done what speculation could not. It had separated fact from assumption. Robert Naparest's name immediately changed the understanding of the case. Investigators now looked back at his history and saw connections that had previously been unknown. His background contained serious warning signs, and his later conviction for the murders of Samantha Bassett and her young daughter Jasmine revealed the devastating extent of his violence. The discovery created a disturbing realization. The person responsible for Rachel's murder had not disappeared into a completely unknown life. He had continued to exist within the criminal justice system. The investigation into Napper became an examination of both a single murder and a much larger question. How had someone capable of such extreme violence remained unidentified for so long? As detectives studied Naparest's history, they learned more about his mental health struggles and previous behavior. He had experienced serious psychiatric problems, including schizophrenia, and his condition became a central part of understanding his actions. But for Rachel's family, the most important fact remained simple. The person who killed Rachel had finally been named. After years of uncertainty, they no longer had to wonder whether the case would ever be solved. They no longer had to hear speculation about unknown suspects. They finally knew the truth. However, the discovery also reopened painful memories of the years before the breakthrough. The arrest of Colin Stagg had left a lasting impact. The public had watched as one investigation unfolded in front of cameras, only for it to collapse in court. The contrast between the two investigations was striking. The case against Stagg was built largely around interpretation and suspicion. The case against Napper was built around forensic evidence. That difference became one of the most important lessons from the entire investigation. In criminal cases, investigators must constantly balance instinct with proof. Experience can help detectives identify possible suspects and understand behavior, but evidence must ultimately determine guilt. The Rachel Nichols case demonstrated what can happen when that balance is lost. The public pressure surrounding the murder was intense. The crime had shocked Britain. The media wanted a resolution. The police wanted answers. Everyone wanted the same thing: justice for Rachel. But the urgency to solve a crime can create risks. A theory can become attractive because it appears to explain everything. A suspect can appear convincing because certain details seem to fit. But without reliable evidence, those conclusions can lead investigators away from the truth. The DNA breakthrough corrected that mistake. It did not rely on appearance. It did not rely on personality. It did not rely on public opinion. It relied on science. The identification of Robert Napper became one of the most important examples of the power of forensic evidence in British criminal history. It showed that even when years pass, evidence collected at a crime scene can remain valuable. It showed that technology can transform investigations long after the original search has ended. And it gave a message of hope to families connected to other unsolved cases around the world. A cold case does not always mean a forgotten case. Sometimes it means the right answer has not yet been discovered. Sometimes the evidence is waiting for the right technology. Sometimes justice arrives years after everyone thought the opportunity had disappeared. The Rachel Nichols investigation became proof of that possibility. The case that had once seemed destined to remain unresolved had been changed by a scientific breakthrough. A tiny biological clue preserved from a crime scene years earlier had finally revealed the truth. But even after the breakthrough, the story still carried unanswered questions. Because solving the murder was only one part of the tragedy. The next challenge was understanding what happened after the crime, the decisions that shaped the investigation, the failures that allowed criticism to grow, and the wider impact the case had on British policing. The murder of Rachel Nichols was no longer a mystery, but it remained a warning. A warning about assumptions. A warning about pressure. And a reminder that in the search for justice, the truth must always be stronger than the desire for an easy answer. When Robert Napper was finally identified as the man responsible for Rachel Nichols' murder, Britain did not simply close the file on one of its most notorious crimes. Instead, the case became a lasting examination of how investigations are conducted, how evidence is evaluated, and how the pursuit of justice can sometimes create its own failures. The murder had begun as a shocking act of violence on Wimbledon Common. It had transformed into a national obsession. It had led to one of the most controversial police operations of the 1990s, and it had ended with a scientific breakthrough that proved the truth had been waiting in the evidence all along. But the path between those moments revealed deep lessons about modern criminal investigation. The first and most painful lesson came from what happened to Colin Stagg. For years, Stagg had been remembered by many people as the man police suspected of killing Rachel Nichol. His arrest had been announced publicly. His name had been connected to one of the most disturbing crimes in Britain. But after the prosecution collapsed, the reality became clear. Suspicion had replaced evidence. The DNA evidence that eventually identified Robert Napper also confirmed what had already been established in court. Colin Stagg was not Rachel's killer. The case became a powerful example of how damaging an incorrect accusation can be. Even when someone is cleared legally, the effects of public suspicion can remain for years. The media coverage, the assumptions, and the emotional reaction surrounding a high-profile crime can create a lasting mark that is difficult to remove. The experience also raised serious questions about investigative methods. The undercover operation used against Stagg became one of the most debated aspects of the case. Police had hoped to obtain a confession or incriminating information, but the evidence gathered was later judged unreliable and inadmissible. The court's decision highlighted concerns about whether investigators had crossed the line between gathering evidence and attempting to create it. The case forced law enforcement agencies to examine how undercover tactics should be used and what safeguards were necessary to protect suspects' rights. But while the controversy surrounding Stagg dominated headlines for years, another story was unfolding quietly. The story of the evidence. The DNA profile recovered from Rachel's murder scene never disappeared. It remained preserved, waiting for forensic science to advance. Unlike memories, which fade over time, and witnesses, who may become unavailable, physical evidence can survive for decades. This became one of the most important messages from the case. Time does not always destroy the truth. Sometimes time allows science to discover it. When investigators eventually linked the DNA evidence to Robert Napper, the breakthrough demonstrated the extraordinary value of preserving forensic material. The case became part of a wider movement in criminal justice where old investigations were being reconsidered using new technology. Across the world, cold cases were being reopened. Evidence once considered limited was being analyzed again. Crimes that had remained unsolved for years were finally receiving answers. The Rachel Nichol case became a symbol of that transformation. It also changed public understanding of DNA evidence. Before the 1990s, many people viewed forensic science as something distant and complicated. But cases like Rachel's showed ordinary people how powerful scientific evidence could be. A single biological sample could challenge years of assumptions. A laboratory result could overturn a public narrative. A microscopic trace could reveal the identity of someone who had remained hidden for years. The case also forced Britain to confront difficult questions about mental health and criminal responsibility. Robert Napper's history revealed a complex and troubling picture. He had serious psychiatric problems and had displayed dangerous behavior before the murder. His later conviction for the murders of Samantha Bissett and her daughter Jasmine made clear the level of harm he was capable of causing. The fact that he had committed multiple violent crimes led to intense debate. Could earlier intervention have prevented tragedy? Were warning signs missed? Could different decisions by authorities have changed the outcome? These questions did not have simple answers. The case involved many different systems: police, mental health services, courts, and medical professionals. Each operated with limited information at different points in time. Looking back with knowledge of what eventually happened made those decisions easier to criticize, but the reality of preventing future violence remained extremely complex. Still, the tragedy highlighted the importance of communication, risk assessment, and appropriate management of individuals considered dangerous. For Rachel's family, however, the broader debates were secondary to one simple truth. Rachel was gone. No investigation could change that. No scientific breakthrough could return the years they had lost. Justice could identify the person responsible, but it could not repair the absence left behind. That is the reality behind many cold cases. The public often focuses on the moment of arrest, the courtroom, and the final verdict. But for families, the journey is much longer. It includes years of uncertainty, unanswered questions, and the emotional weight of wondering whether the truth will ever come. Rachel's story became part of that larger human experience. A family waiting, a community remembering, a justice system searching for answers, and eventually, science providing the missing piece. The legacy of the Rachel Nichols case was not only the conviction of Robert Napper, it was the transformation of how Britain viewed criminal investigations. The case showed why evidence must come before assumption. It showed why forensic science matters. It showed why unresolved cases should not always be abandoned. And it showed that even when justice takes years, the truth can still emerge. The path across Wimbledon Common, where Rachel once walked, remains open today. People continue to pass through the same landscape. They walk their dogs. They enjoy the quiet surroundings. They move through a place that has slowly returned to everyday life. But history remains beneath the surface. Because that ground holds the memory of a tragedy that changed countless lives. A tragedy that began with one terrible morning in July 1992. A tragedy that took years to understand. And a case that proved one of the most powerful ideas in modern criminal investigation. The truth may wait. But it does not disappear. The murder of Rachel Nichols was finally solved, but the impact of the case continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. For nearly 2 decades, her name had been connected to one of Britain's most painful criminal investigations. It was a story of violence, uncertainty, mistakes, scientific progress, and a family's long search for answers. The final truth was now known. Robert Napper was responsible for Rachel's death. But the journey to that truth revealed something much larger than one murder investigation. It revealed the challenges faced when police attempt to solve a crime under enormous public pressure. It revealed the dangers of focusing on a suspect before the evidence is strong enough. And it revealed the extraordinary power of forensic science to correct the mistakes of the past. When Napper was identified through DNA evidence, it changed the historical understanding of the case. For years, the investigation had been remembered because of Colin Stagg, the man who had been accused and later cleared. But the DNA evidence created a clear separation between suspicion and reality. The real killer had never been the man standing at the center of the media storm. He had been someone else entirely. Robert Napper's identification forced investigators to revisit every stage of the original inquiry. They examined what had been known in 1992, what had been missed, and what could only be understood years later with improved technology. The case demonstrated one of the fundamental difficulties of policing. Investigators are forced to make decisions with the information available at the time. They do not know what future evidence will reveal. They must follow leads, evaluate possibilities, and attempt to find patterns in incomplete information. But the Rachel Nichols case showed the danger of allowing a theory to become stronger than the evidence supporting it. The investigation into Colin Stagg had been influenced by behavioral assumptions and the belief that certain characteristics made him resemble the offender investigators imagined. But resemblance is not proof. A person's personality is not evidence. A person's lifestyle is not evidence. A person's appearance is not evidence. Only reliable facts can establish guilt. The eventual identification of Robert Napper reinforced that lesson in the clearest possible way. The DNA evidence did not care about public opinion. It did not care about media attention. It did not care about investigative theories. It simply revealed the scientific connection between the crime scene and the person responsible. That was why the breakthrough was so significant. It represented justice achieved through evidence rather than assumption. The case also became an important moment in the development of forensic investigation in Britain. It demonstrated why preserving evidence from unsolved crimes is so important. The samples collected at Wimbledon Common in 1992 remained valuable years later because investigators had protected them and because technology continued to improve. At the time of the murder, the evidence could not provide the answer. A decade later, it could. The lesson was clear. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the right scientific breakthrough. For other families living with unsolved crimes, the Rachel Nichols investigation offered a message of hope. It showed that time does not always favor the person who committed the crime. Advances in technology can reopen investigations and uncover truths that once seemed impossible to discover. But the case also left behind difficult questions. One of the most painful was whether Rachel's death could have been prevented. By the time investigators identified Napper, they knew more about his history of violence and mental health problems. His previous convictions and psychiatric issues raised questions about whether warning signs had been overlooked. The murders of Samantha Bissett and her daughter Jasmine in 1993 became a crucial part of understanding Napper's history. Those crimes demonstrated that his violence was not limited to one incident. They revealed the danger he represented and intensified public debate about how authorities manage individuals with severe mental health problems who may pose a risk. The discussion was complicated. It was not simply about blaming one organization or one individual. It involved difficult questions about prediction, prevention, and responsibility. How can authorities identify someone who may become violent? How can society protect the public while respecting the rights of individuals? How should mental health services respond when someone shows dangerous behavior? The Rachel Nichols case did not provide easy answers, but it forced these questions into public discussion. For Rachel's family, however, the most important part of the story was always personal. Rachel was not only a victim in a criminal investigation. She was a daughter. She was a mother. She was a person whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of her death. The media often focuses on the mystery, the investigation, and the search for the offender. But behind every cold case is a family whose life has been permanently changed. Rachel's son, Alex, grew up without his mother. Her parents lived through years of uncertainty. Her loved ones carried a loss that could never be repaired by a court decision. Justice could identify the person responsible. It could confirm the truth, but it could not restore the future Rachel should have had. That reality remained at the heart of the case. The murder of Rachel Nichols was eventually solved, but it was never simply a story about catching a criminal. It was also a story about the consequences of violence, the importance of evidence, and the long road families travel when justice is delayed. The case became one of Britain's most studied investigations because it contained both failure and success. Failure in the early rush toward the wrong suspect. Success in the eventual use of DNA to identify the true offender. Failure in the years when answers seemed impossible. Success in proving that science could still uncover the truth. And perhaps the greatest lesson was this: justice is not always a straight line. Sometimes it moves through mistake. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes the truth remains hidden until the world develops a new way to find it. For Rachel Nichols, that moment finally came. The mystery that had haunted Britain since the summer of 1992 was no longer a mystery. The name of the killer was known. The evidence had spoken. And after years of silence, Rachel's story finally had the ending that her family had been waiting for. Not an ending without pain. Not an ending that erased the past, but an ending built on truth. The murder of Rachel Nichols was no longer an unanswered mystery. The scientific evidence had identified Robert Napper. The legal process had acknowledged his responsibility. The investigation that had consumed Britain for years had finally reached its conclusion. But some cases do not disappear when the courtroom doors close. Some cases remain because they change the way people think about crime, justice, and the search for truth. The Rachel Nichols case became one of those cases. It was remembered not only because of the horror of the crime itself, but because of everything that followed. The investigation exposed the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. It showed how public pressure could influence decisions. It demonstrated the importance of protecting evidence. And it proved that advances in science could transform cases that once appeared impossible to solve. For detectives looking back at the investigation, the story contained two very different chapters. The first chapter was about uncertainty. The second was about discovery. In the early days after Rachel's murder, police were confronted with an enormous challenge. The crime had occurred in a public place, but there were no immediate answers. Wimbledon Common was large, busy, and constantly changing. People had passed through the area before and after the attack. Potential witnesses existed, but memories were incomplete. The offender had left behind limited information that could immediately identify him. Investigators had to work through thousands of possibilities. Every interview mattered. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every decision carried consequences. The pressure was extraordinary because the crime had captured national attention. The public wanted reassurance. They wanted to know that the person responsible had been found. They wanted to believe that the danger had ended. But criminal investigations do not always move at the speed of public expectation. Sometimes the truth takes longer. The case demonstrated the importance of resisting the temptation to find a quick answer simply because people demand one. The arrest of Colin Stagg became a defining example of what can happen when a suspect becomes the center of an investigation before the evidence is strong enough. The consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. The case affected public confidence. It affected policing methods. And it affected the life of an innocent man. The later discovery of Robert Napper through DNA changed the way many people viewed the earlier investigation. It showed that the original focus had been misplaced. It confirmed that the truth had always depended on evidence rather than assumptions. This became one of the most important lessons from Rachel's case. A criminal investigation is not a search for someone who appears to fit a theory. It is a search for facts. The DNA evidence that eventually identified Napper represented the power of patience. When the murder occurred in 1992, investigators had collected evidence that could not yet provide the answer, but they preserved it, they waited. And when technology improved, the evidence finally revealed what had been hidden. That moment represented a turning point in British criminal justice. The public began to understand that forensic science could change the fate of old cases. A crime committed years earlier could suddenly move forward. Evidence that once seemed limited could become decisive. The Rachel Nicholl investigation became part of a larger transformation in policing. Across Britain and around the world, law enforcement agencies increasingly relied on DNA databases and improved laboratory methods. Cold cases that had remained unresolved for years were revisited. Families who had spent decades waiting for answers began to see new possibilities. The message was powerful. Time does not erase evidence. Time does not erase the possibility of justice. But the case also remained a warning about the human side of investigations. Behind every suspect, every headline, and every courtroom argument are real people affected by the process. For Colin Stagg, the investigation became a reminder of how damaging public accusations can be. Even after being cleared, the experience followed him. His case became frequently discussed in debates about fairness, media responsibility, and the treatment of individuals who are investigated but never convicted. For Rachel's family, the years of waiting represented a different kind of suffering. They were not waiting for a mystery to be solved like a story in a newspaper. They were waiting for answers about someone they loved. They were waiting to know who had taken Rachel away from them. They were waiting for the person responsible to finally be identified. When that answer came, it brought a form of closure, but closure did not mean forgetting. The loss remained. The memories remained. The impact remained. The case also changed the way the public viewed the relationship between mental health and crime. Robert Napper's psychiatric history became an important part of understanding the events surrounding Rachel's murder. His diagnosis of serious mental illness and his history of violence raised difficult questions about how society identifies and responds to individuals who may pose a danger. These discussions were complex because the connection between mental illness and violence cannot be reduced to simple explanations. Most people with mental health conditions are not violent. But Napare's case highlighted the importance of recognizing serious warning signs and ensuring that systems designed to protect the public function effectively. The tragedy of Rachel's death became part of a broader conversation about prevention. Could earlier intervention have changed the outcome? Could different decisions have prevented future victims? Could better communication between agencies have made a difference? These questions continued long after the legal proceedings ended. The answers were not simple, but asking them became part of the legacy of the case. Today, Wimbledon Common remains a place of ordinary life. People walk through it every day. Families spend time there. The landscape continues to exist beyond the tragedy that occurred there. But for many people, the location carries a permanent memory, a reminder of a young mother whose life ended in a moment of unimaginable violence. A reminder of a child who lost his mother. A reminder of a family who waited years for justice. And a reminder of the importance of searching for truth carefully and responsibly. The Rachel Nichols case was eventually solved because evidence survived long enough for science to catch up. But the deeper lesson was not only about DNA. It was about patience. It was about accuracy. It was about remembering that justice is not achieved simply by finding someone to blame. Justice requires finding the right person. And after years of uncertainty, controversy, and unanswered questions, the truth finally emerged. Robert Napper was identified. Rachel's name was cleared from the shadows of speculation. And one of Britain's most haunting cold cases became a powerful example of how science, perseverance, and the pursuit of truth can finally bring answers even when decades have passed. When Robert Napper was finally identified and held responsible for the murder of Rachel Nichols, many believed the story had reached its final page. After years of uncertainty, controversy, and public attention, the mystery had been solved. The name of the offender was known. The evidence had been examined. The legal process had concluded. But the Rachel Nichols case did not simply disappear into history. Some crimes become more than crimes. They become lessons. They become warnings. They become moments when society is forced to examine itself. Rachel's murder became one of those moments. The case revealed how difficult it can be to balance the need for justice with the responsibility to protect innocent people. It showed how quickly public fear can influence an investigation. It demonstrated how powerful the media can be in shaping public opinion. And it proved that science, even when it arrives years later, can challenge assumptions and reveal the truth. The most visible lesson came from the treatment of Colin Stagg. For many years, his name was associated with a crime he did not commit. The investigation had placed him under intense public scrutiny, and the collapse of the prosecution revealed the dangers of building a case around a theory rather than solid evidence. His experience became an important example in discussions about wrongful accusations. The justice system is designed around a fundamental principle. A person is innocent until proven guilty. But in high-profile cases, public opinion can move faster than the evidence. A suspect can become a symbol. A theory can become accepted as fact. A headline can become more powerful than a courtroom decision. The Rachel Nichols investigation demonstrated why caution is essential. Detectives must follow leads. They must consider possibilities. They must use experience and instinct. But those things must always be tested against reliable evidence. The eventual identification of Robert Napper through DNA reinforced that principle. The scientific evidence did not depend on emotion or public pressure. It did not depend on whether someone appeared suspicious. It provided a direct connection between the crime scene and the person responsible. That difference changed everything. The case became a landmark example of forensic science correcting human error. The DNA evidence had been collected years earlier. It had existed quietly while investigators searched for answers. It had waited while technology developed. And when the time came, it provided the breakthrough that finally resolved the mystery. This became one of the strongest arguments for preserving evidence from unsolved crimes. A case that appears impossible today may not remain impossible forever. Technology changes. Scientific methods improve. New generations of investigators bring new perspectives. The evidence that cannot speak today may speak tomorrow. The Rachel Nichols case became part of a wider transformation in criminal investigations around the world. DNA technology changed how police approached unsolved crimes. Old evidence was revisited. Previous assumptions were questioned. Cases once considered beyond resolution were reopened. For families of victims, these developments offered something that had once seemed impossible: hope. The possibility that the passage of time did not necessarily mean the disappearance of justice. But behind the scientific achievement was a human tragedy that could never be forgotten. Rachel Nichols was not remembered only because of the circumstances of her death. She was remembered because of the life she had before it. She was a young mother. She was a daughter. She was a friend. The crime investigation often focused on the offender, the evidence, and the search for answers. But the center of the story was always the person who was lost. The years following Rachel's death were years her family could never recover. The eventual identification of Robert Napper answered the question of who was responsible. But it could not answer the deeper question faced by every family affected by murder. And why did this happen? No court ruling could restore the future Rachel should have had. No scientific discovery could return the moments stolen from her family. Justice could reveal the truth, but it could not erase the pain. The case also left a lasting discussion about the role of mental health in criminal justice. Robert Napper's history forced difficult conversations about how authorities respond to individuals with severe psychiatric disorders who may pose risks to others. His previous convictions and documented mental health problems raised questions about whether opportunities for intervention had been missed. These questions became part of the broader examination of the case. However, the discussion required careful understanding. Mental illness is complex, and the vast majority of people experiencing mental health problems are not dangerous. The issue highlighted by the case was not mental illness itself, but how society identifies and manages situations where an individual demonstrates serious risks of violence. The tragedy showed the importance of effective systems, communication, and appropriate support. It showed that prevention is often just as important as punishment. The Rachel Nichols case also changed the way investigators approach the relationship between public pressure and police decision-making. High-profile crimes create enormous demands for answers. The public wants certainty. Families want justice. The media wants developments. But investigations must operate on facts. The case became a reminder that the most important goal is not simply solving a crime quickly. It is solving it correctly. Because a wrong answer can create another tragedy. An innocent person can suffer. The real offender can remain free. And the search for justice can move further away from the truth. The final resolution of Rachel's murder proved that patience and evidence matter more than speed. Years after the crime, the truth emerged. Not because investigators gave up. Not because the case was forgotten. But because the evidence remained available and because science continued to advance. The story of Rachel Nichols became a powerful reminder that every unsolved case represents a person, a family, and a question waiting for an answer. Behind every file number is a human life. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. Behind every cold case is the possibility that one day the silence will end. For Rachel, that day eventually came. The investigation that began with fear and uncertainty ended with scientific proof. The name of the killer became known. The truth became official. And the case that had haunted Britain for years became one of the clearest examples of a simple but powerful idea. Justice may be delayed, but when the evidence survives, the truth can still find its way home. For years, the murderer of Rachel Nichols remained one of Britain's most haunting mysteries. It began with a peaceful summer morning on Wimbledon Common and became a story that would challenge investigators, influence policing practices, and demonstrate the extraordinary power of forensic science. It was a case defined by tragedy, controversy, and finally, the discovery of the truth. The final answer had arrived. Robert Napper was responsible for Rachel's death. But the story of the case was never only about finding a killer. It was about the long road to justice. It was about the consequences of mistakes. It was about a family waiting for answers. And it was about the evidence that survived long enough to reveal what happened. On July 15th, 1992, Rachel Nichol walked onto Wimbledon Common with her young son Alex and their dog. It was a normal moment in an ordinary day, a mother spending time outdoors with her child, a familiar routine, a peaceful environment. But within moments, everything changed. Rachel was brutally attacked and killed. Her death shocked Britain because it destroyed a sense of security that many people associated with public spaces. Wimbledon Common was not an isolated wilderness. It was a place where people walked, exercised, and spent time with their families. The crime created fear because it felt impossible. A person could be attacked in daylight. A child could lose a mother in an instant. A community could be changed forever. The investigation that followed became one of the largest and most complex in British criminal history. Police searched for witnesses. They collected forensic evidence. They examined every possible lead. But despite enormous efforts, the identity of the offender remained unknown. Then came the investigation into Colin Stagg. His arrest became one of the most controversial moments in the case. For a time, many people believed the mystery had been solved. But the evidence did not support that conclusion. The prosecution collapsed. Stagg was cleared, and the investigation was forced to begin again. That moment became one of the defining lessons of the Rachel Nichol case. A criminal investigation cannot be built on belief alone. It cannot depend on what seems likely. It cannot depend on who appears to fit a profile. It must depend on evidence. Years later, that evidence finally provided the answer. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to return to material collected from the original crime scene. What had been impossible to interpret in 1992 became decisive years later. A DNA profile matched Robert Napper. The discovery changed everything. The man who had committed one of Britain's most notorious murders had finally been identified. For Rachel's family, it was the moment they had waited for. But it was also a reminder of everything they had lost. The years had passed. The pain had remained. The truth had arrived, but it could not undo the tragedy. In 2008, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nichol on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was ordered to remain detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital. The legal outcome reflected the complexity of the case. Napper was held responsible for Rachel's death, but the court also recognized the role of his serious mental health condition. The conclusion was not a simple ending. It was a complicated one. Because cases like Rachel's do not end when a verdict is delivered. They continue through memory. They continue through the families left behind. They continue through the lessons learned. The Rachel Nichol investigation changed the way Britain viewed criminal investigations. It became a warning about the dangers of investigative tunnel vision. It showed the importance of protecting evidence. It demonstrated that forensic science could provide answers years after a crime had been committed. Perhaps the most powerful part of the story was that the evidence had always been there. The truth had not disappeared. It had been waiting for technology, waiting for scientific progress, waiting for the moment when investigators could finally understand what the evidence had been trying to say. The case became an example of why cold cases remain important. Because behind every unsolved crime is a person, a family, a community, a question that refuses to disappear. The murder of Rachel Nichol also left behind a difficult conversation about responsibility and prevention. The history of Robert Napper raised questions about whether more could have been done before tragedy occurred. Those questions continue to influence discussions about mental health services, risk assessment, and public protection. There were no easy answers. But the questions mattered, because every tragedy creates an opportunity to learn, to improve, and to prevent future suffering. Today, Wimbledon Common continues as a public space where people walk, exercise, and enjoy the outdoors. Life has returned to the landscape, but history remains. For some, the paths are still connected to the memory of Rachel, a young woman whose life ended far too soon, a mother whose child lost her in the most devastating way, a family who waited years for justice. The story of Rachel Nichol is ultimately a story about truth surviving through time. It is a story about how a case can become lost in uncertainty, yet still find its way back toward justice. It is a story about the importance of evidence, about the responsibility of investigators, about the need to protect the innocent while searching for the guilty, and about the fact that even the darkest mysteries can eventually be answered. The killer who walked away from Wimbledon Common in 1992 believed he had escaped detection. For years, it appeared that he had, but the evidence remained silent, patient, waiting. And decades later, it finally revealed the truth. Rachel Nichol's name was no longer attached to an unsolved mystery. Her family finally had answers. The investigation was finally complete. And one of Britain's most unforgettable cold cases became a lasting reminder of a simple truth. The passage of time may slow justice, but it does not always stop it.